about everybody's favorite topic, artificial intelligence.
Now, in 3 years, I actually do think that there's going to be mainstream adoption, and we're going to start going into maybe the late adopters of the chasm, right? And then in 5 years,
who knows, right?
Hard for me to say what that looks like.
Hey, Divya, welcome to the Dome podcast. Divya is one of our senior investing partners at Geodesic Capital. She did her undergraduate studies at UCLA and then got her MBA from Harvard University. She started her career in investment banking at companies like Credit Suisse, and then switched over to venture capital and was with In-Q-Tel, which is the VC arm of the US government intelligence agencies. After that, Divya joined Intel Capital, which is the CVC arm of Intel Corporation, where she was the investment director. And then she joined us at Geodesic Capital just a little over a year ago. Has it been? A little over a year ago?
Yeah.
And she focuses on enterprise software, which is a massive market and one of the most important areas of innovation these days. Did I miss anything?
No, that was a great intro.
Okay, great. So there's so much happening in AI these days. It seems like it's everywhere, right? It's in the enterprise, it's in startups, it's in government, society. How do you think about AI kind of as an industry, like with so much happening? How do you break it down? How do you kind of categorize things to, make it more digestible?
Yeah. AI is, we all know has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
We're certainly in a different phase right now where it's becoming more usable, more relevant to pretty much all of us. And so happy to kind of break down how I think about the space. But I think first I want to caveat that the space has been changing so rapidly.
Yeah.
I think every day we see new innovation that's disrupting our thought process around a particular space within AI. And so, we're trying to keep an open mind in terms of how the space is going. But at its core, I think it's helpful to map out, what we mean by AI. And so at the very foundational layer, you basically have compute, right? And so this is basically how we get our systems to run. And so the GPU, graphic processing unit from NVIDIA is really powering a lot of the AI innovation that we're seeing. So you have that. There are some new companies that are competing, with NVIDIA or trying to compete. But you also have the cloud service providers like Amazon, Google, that are also thinking, and Microsoft that are thinking about, how do I build my own GPU so I'm not reliant on just NVIDIA? So it's a very, popular space just because there's a lot of value accruing there right now as people spend a lot on compute. So that's the very base layer. From there, you obviously have storage, right? And distribution of compute. So that's where the cloud service providers come in. I think, many enterprises today use one of the big three providers, but there's also new companies like Lambda Labs and CoreWeave, which can provide you with GPU compute as well. And so those are also becoming popular within the AI space. So that's basically the core, compute storage layer. And so then from there goes the next layer around data. And so this is another core infrastructure layer where, organizations have their data stored in whether it's a cloud service provider like AWS or companies like our portfolio company Databricks or Snowflake. And this is really important because we're going to get into the other layers going forward, but for you to build models and really applications, you need to have this data layer in order to, take advantage of that. Next, after the data layer, you basically have foundational models, right? And so these are the companies that we've all been talking about, whether it's OpenAI, Cohere, Anthropic. There's also a number of open source products that are coming out, open source LLM products that are coming out. And so these are essentially the models that kind of spurred the innovation that we're seeing in the space, where you can use large language models to generate text responses to questions that you may ask, or you can use something like Stable Diffusion, which is generating images in response to a text query that you might make. And so this is one layer of innovation. And then to utilize these models to essentially build applications, you need developer tooling. And so we're seeing a number of companies in this layer which help your data scientist or machine learning engineer do everything from experiment with different models to fine tune the models for the data that you have, to deploy the models, do observability to make sure the models are working properly. And so this is another very popular layer. And then above that is really where you get into the more horizontal and vertical applications. Everything from, legal applications, sales, marketing, customer success. We're seeing innovation in healthcare. And so it's a rapidly evolving space where I think every day you're seeing new startups pop up, but very exciting.
The Japanese government actually is very focused on that first compute layer. Japan used to own 50% of the world semiconductor market. It's over time falling to 10%, but it's still pretty significant. And with all that's happening in AI, they're trying to really fund kind of the next generation of semiconductor / GPU companies here in Japan. And so a lot of effort is going into that space. When I'm looking out there and seeing what everyone's doing, a couple of months ago, Google had their annual developer conference, Google I/O. Last week, Microsoft had their annual partner conference, Microsoft Inspire. And all they were talking about is AI. And these are, of course, the giants of technology. And it just seems like they're putting so much effort, so much investment into this space, upgrading all of their products with artificial intelligence functionality. Of course, they're also the providers of cloud infrastructure, and so offering all kinds of developer tools for developing artificial intelligence. And then you have, of course, I would say the existing startup community, which many of which we've invested in. And a lot of them, of course, in fact, I would say all of them are also doing the same thing, right, with their products at a smaller scale, but still, upgrading their products with artificial intelligence, adding natural language interface to whatever it is that they do to make their products more useful and more efficient. And then I think we have, as you're talking about, new startups, which, it seems like there's hundreds being born every day. And so I was just wondering how you think about, the competitive dynamics in the market right now. Like, who's going to win? What's going to happen ultimately? And I guess maybe each of these layers have their own niches, but, how do you think about that, like as a capital allocator, when you look at what's happening in the market?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and probably the billion or trillion dollar question in this market, right? In terms of who's going to win and where the value ultimately accrues. So maybe just starting off with the large cloud players, right? Because I think we're seeing that they're very active in this market. This came on pretty quickly in terms of their ability to act and invest in the space at a rapid pace. And that's because this is frankly an existential risk for a lot of these companies. They understand that this is essentially a platform shift, and for them to stay relevant in the future, which is AI, they need to make sure that they're set up for that. And so the big announcement that probably came out is, towards the end of last year with Microsoft investing in OpenAI. That was a massive partnership that they undertook and really put a splash on the page, because I think before that, they were tinkering around with creating their own models, weren't necessarily finding success, and realized quickly that they had to partner with a big ecosystem player to make sure that they could take a lead in the space. And so they've done a great job in terms of really in the minds of the developer community, in terms of the partner community, their customers, as being at the forefront about thinking about how to deploy this technology and really commercialize on it. I'm sure, we all saw the announcements that came out last week after their Inspire conference, but they're really taking advantage of their distribution with something like Office 365. Most enterprises use, Microsoft Office or even like GitHub. And so they're starting to integrate, the capabilities through OpenAI into their products to help speed up work. it hasn't necessarily been fully rolled out yet, but we've seen the announcements in terms of what they're planning to do. They're planning to start increasing pricing to charge for it.
Yeah.
And so I would say that they probably have a lead in terms of all the big players, in terms of thinking about commercialization, and really a valid point in terms of how they capture that market. So on the next phase, you have someone like Google, right?
Yeah. Can I say something really quickly about Microsoft first? Sure. You made a point about how they're not only building technology, but leveraging their distribution, which, was really interesting. I think they mentioned that Microsoft 365 Copilot was going to be like $30 a month or something. But Bing Chat Enterprise, which also seemed like a really compelling product, they're going to be basically giving away for free for all Microsoft 365 users, right? And so, I think that's probably kind of like a competitive area with, like Slack and stuff like that, right? And so, where they can charge, it seems like they're charging, and they're charging a pretty healthy amount. But where they're still really trying to compete and gain market share, it seems like they're giving it away, and so that distribution really gives them such an advantage in the marketplace. And that's why I asked the question up front about who's going to win here. Ultimately, if the big players decide that they just want to use their distribution to crush startups, it's certainly something that they can do. And I know they have to be careful because there's antitrust concerns and things like that. But certainly they have all the tools there, and where they want to compete and where they want to win, it seems like it'd be really difficult for startups to compete with them.
No, that's a really good point, Marcus. And probably really smart in terms of how Microsoft is thinking about their strategy. And so if you think about Office 365, they have consumers that are already paying for it. These customers are probably very sensitive about their data. And so they don't want to necessarily let that leak out to continue training OpenAI or Microsoft's models. And so they need to basically have an offering where an enterprise can keep their data private. It's not being necessarily sensitive data isn't getting leaked out, but they can still take advantage of the AI offerings that Microsoft is offering.
Yeah, I know you were going to talk about Google, but the other big battle that's happening isn't always between big tech and startups, but the battle between big tech is also like really incredible, right? With Bing, finally kind of like making this run to try to topple Google's monopoly in search again, right? I mean, that's really interesting. Kind of.
And so on Google, if you look at something in terms of like how they're thinking about this, they actually have more of a product and technical advantage because they acquired DeepMind, right? Many years ago.
2014.
And they've been working on this problem for a long time.
Yeah.
They've just been slow to roll it out, partially because they were worried about the implications of rolling out this technology and, the implications it would have on society, which I know, we've all been talking about as well. And so, they kind of came in to this position where once OpenAI made their big splash with GPT last year, where they had to respond really quickly. It became, all hands on deck for them. And so not only do they have their own proprietary models, which, I would say are further along than, what Microsoft or some of the other large players have, but they're also partnering with other ecosystem players. So they invested in companies like Anthropic and Cohere. And so not only are they allowing customers or want to allow customers to use their proprietary models, but they're saying, hey, if you want to use these other partner technologies, we can offer them on our platform as well. And so a bit of a kitchen sink approach, but smart in terms of making sure that, you're not closed off to your customers' desires. And so that's on one front. I think they made a bunch of announcements in their developer conference, where they're not only going after the developer tooling area, but they're also building vertical applications. I think the big question for them is how do they monetize, right? It's not maybe as simple, just given their core business today is really driven by ads. And so thinking about monetization and how to make it a big value driver for Google will be something that will be interesting to watch. And then lastly, AWS, Amazon. This one's been interesting, I'd say. They launched a product called Bedrock. And essentially it's a platform where you can use third-party models. So whether that's stable diffusion, you can use coherence models, anthropics, and it allows you to deploy these models on your private data and not necessarily let it leak out and help train these models further. And so very important to enterprises today. How do you make sure that, the models are being deployed within your VPC and not, leaking out to the public?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're taking more of that strategy. I think, they've had some like recent announcements where they're launching products, especially in like healthcare transcription that got announced recently. But TBD in terms of, how they really capture the market. It's another one that I'm watching.
Let's move the conversation, I guess, down into the startup layer. We have a lot of visibility, obviously, into our portfolio companies. But what kind of things have you observed happening there? Kind of with, I guess I would say, companies that we focus on, which are kind of like the mid to late stage companies, already established, have lots of customers, working go to market, product market fit. Like, what are those companies doing?
Yeah. So for, companies that kind of already have product market fit, have a set of customers, this is really becoming table stakes, right? I think the pace at which I've seen these companies react to the trends in the market has been fascinating.
Yeah.
Unlike anything I've seen before, right? I think as soon as the news hit with OpenAI last year, a lot of them were thinking about, how do I embed this in my product?
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing companies from the application layer all the way down to, infrastructure, cyber deploying, or thinking about how to use generative AI. And so some are either embedding it as part of their product to make it better. And so, you can have a co-pilot sort of in terms of using the product and being able to use it better. So for instance, Workato, which is one of our portfolio companies, recently launched a product called AI at Work. And this is essentially a co-pilot to help their customers be able to use Workato more easily. Mm-hmm. So in terms of building recipes for workflow automation, figuring out connectors, they essentially have this assistant that is powered by generative AI, which is really interesting. And then you have other companies that are basically launching a whole new product that's powered by generative AI. And so SourceGraph, which is another portfolio company of ours, has a product called Cody that's been out in market. And this basically is another sort of AI assistant, but it helps you with generating code based on your code repos, all the information that it's gathered. And so very powerful tool. They're actually charging for this separately. So essentially a new product line to help expand their total addressable market.
They're actually doing quite well in Japan too. The Cody product.
I know they're getting a lot of good uptake. And so I think like every company either has a product already out in market, or it's in very top level discussions in terms of how should we be thinking about this. It is also an existential threat for their businesses, right? And so it's important that they move fast. And so the innovation has been pretty interesting.
Yeah, I was talking to the country managers of one of our portfolio companies here in Japan, and he was saying, they had promised like a localized product to their customers here. And this was last year. But once ChatGPT came out and everybody started to, think about AI, all those localization plans kind of got scrapped or put on the back burner because, the entire engineering team was focused on, building artificial intelligence into the product. And, as a company, like you said, it's existential and definitely the right decision, for the company. What about brand new startups? So you mentioned a few of the ones, that are out there in the news already, obviously OpenAI, Anthropic. Any other kind of interesting areas, that you think might turn into, real businesses over time, might be able to monetize, might be able to, build a defensible moat?
Yeah. And I think that's probably the main thing that, we're thinking about, right? This is kind of a unique space where you have incumbents reacting so quickly and launching products so quickly that how do you, as a new startup who might not necessarily have distribution power, a data moat, think about succeeding as an individual company? And so there's definitely been quite a few interesting companies that, we've been seeing. To name a few, there's one company called Runway ML, They are essentially a text to image or video generator. They're basically a full stack solution where the creators of Runway were also the creators of an open source model called Stable Diffusion. And so on top of that, they built a proprietary product. And so you can do anything from type text, like say, I want to create a scene with horses riding near the mountains. And it can basically spit out a video for you, which is pretty crazy to think about, right?
Yeah, it's amazing.
In terms of the technology that's required. Now it's, evolving technology. It's not completely perfect today, but it has potential. For instance, you've seen that it's been used in movies and commercials already. And so like, for instance, the Oscar-winning movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once, this company's product was used for some of the scenes. Not only can it do text to video generation, but it can also do like editing of video. It's much easier to use it to, remove objects from a video or add objects.
And that's one of the reasons why all the screenwriters are kind of striking right now, I think, right? It's existential for all these people who, do that for a living. So anyway, we're not going to get into that part of it, but I just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And so this company actually, you would think Adobe could be a big competitor here. And, obviously like Adobe has a place in this market, but the fact that they own the full value chain from model all the way to the application gives them an advantage because they can continue improving upon this model that's actually an open source model as well to continue improving upon, the videos that they can generate, how realistic they are. They're also very focused on workflow, right? And so they're focused on creatives. Think about, an animation studio, someone who is creating one scene of a cartoon character, climbing steps. They're enabling end-to-end workflow for these personas, which historically, there hasn't been much innovation in that space just because it's hard technology to build. And so the fact that they have both the advantage with the model, but then also building more of an end-to-end workflow makes this a potentially very large and interesting company that we've been looking at.
But where are we though, right? In the hype cycle and, relative to the S curve? I guess with the hype cycle, we're kind of at the peak of hype, I would think. But as far as the S curve goes, are we pre-chasm? Are we in the chasm? Are there some technologies that have crossed the chasm? How do you think about that, as an investor?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, right? And I think there's one general answer, and then I'll kind of break it up a bit more. And so in terms of crossing the chasm, I actually do think we've crossed the chasm overall as a technology. We're kind of in this initial, or not the mainstream adopters, but the early adopters. And so the more innovative companies, obviously the big tech companies are doing stuff with this. We're kind of in a tornado phase, right? Where a lot of the more innovative companies are thinking about, how do I build this into my product? How do I make sure I have a response to the innovation that's happening in the market so my business isn't threatened? What we are seeing though is that in terms of large enterprise adoption, so them as customers using the product, it's still early days. So, a lot of them are running pilots or POCs to understand how does this technology work? How should I utilize it as a customer? And so I don't think we're at the very mature stage where, every company in the world is necessarily going to use this yet, but we are in this interesting phase where there's a lot of rapid innovation, a lot of rapid uptake happening. I think we, in every board meeting or every earnings call, you hear CEOs talking about, generative AI. And so it's top of mind. People are adopting it in some sense, whether it's building it into their product or trying it out. I think where the bifurcation comes though, is that for mission critical types of products, right? And so say, I'm using this in healthcare for more life or death decisions, or I'm reading medical imaging. You're not necessarily going to see this replace humans just yet, right? You're going to have a human in the loop component. It's going to be continuing to evolve in terms of how this technology works. It's not 100% accurate yet, right? And so it's very dangerous to completely rely on it. And so I'd say in terms of adoption, it's earlier for those types of situations. And then, we've been talking about this at Geodesic a lot, but there are certain types of situations where I think you could continue to see this more rapidly go up the chasm. And so things like gaming, where, it's not life or death. You can use this for like generation of video scenes in your games. There's other areas that you can use it as well, where it's much easier to deploy this type of technology, and there's more appetite to do so. And so I think you are going to see that differentiation in terms of who more rapidly adopts it and crossing over to the mainstream.
Like 6-7 years ago, you could take a ride in an autonomous vehicle, and I think watching or thinking back on some of those videos that I watched, and at that time it seemed like, okay, well, this is just around the corner. Autonomous driving is, and of course, Elon Musk famously was like promising full autonomous driving, I think like in 2016. But even today, no one has been able to commercialize autonomous driving at scale. And I think a lot of people really underestimated the difficulty of getting to 100%, like you were saying, in that medical situation, right? Where certain use cases just require perfection, right? And there's no margin for error because people's lives are going to be on the line. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of applications and use cases where, 70, 80, 90% is okay, right? Exactly. I guess it's just a matter of identifying those use cases, exploiting them, building companies, products around them as, innovation and development continues on the harder problems. And hopefully those will come out over time. But getting to that 100% for the applications that require it, I think is going to be super hard, and maybe take a little bit more time than people think.
It will be, right. I think like a lot of models for different situations are not 100% accurate. At the highest end, maybe in the 90th percentile, and so that's fine for situations like a lot of consumer type applications. That's completely fine, right? Like we're just testing different ideas and putting it on the market for people to try. And even enterprise scenarios where you're looking at like customer support. So say you have a chat function where you're helping your customer success rep with answering the next question. It's fine because you have a human in the loop, and it doesn't need to be 100% accurate. Those are fine. So I think it's really understanding how mission critical this application is. Like your autonomous driving example is a perfect reason why it won't be 100% anytime soon. Will be really important as startups, large enterprises think about how they're going to use and deploy this technology.
What about people? Like there's not a lot of talent out there. I mean, because this space has just like blown up so quickly. A lot of companies in Japan are struggling, not only with the development side, and there's like huge demand right now, right, for artificial intelligence, machine learning developers, product managers, and things like that. But also just on the deployment side, right, just understanding the technology to identify even applications that could potentially, be deployed in the enterprise. Like, how are you talking to people about that? Have you noticed that that's kind of an issue with companies in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think like talent was always kind of a big issue with machine learning, right? And so in the last phase, you saw machine learning engineers were a scarce resource. They're still a scarce resource by any means. But one interesting thing that's happening is that this technology is actually also being used by software developers. And so if you're not necessarily training your own model, so say I'm using an off-the-shelf model and just like fine-tuning it, figuring out what prompts to use to make sure that it does what I want it to do in terms of my application, there's potential for software engineers to use their skill sets and, maybe train on a few different modules to get up to speed and be able to use this technology. And so I think for organizations that are, feel like they can use foundational models that exist today, it's fine for them to use software engineers that they already have in their workforce and maybe upskill, their understanding of the space. And so there's a bunch of like academic institutions out there, training institutions. A lot of engineers go to meetups and hackathons to continue like upgrading their skill set. And so like that's one avenue, which I think is interesting because one interesting thing with this whole generative AI wave is that we're now saying potentially you're not going to need to train as many models, right? You already have models that have a training data set that they've used. Maybe you want to fine tune it with the data that you have in your organization. But we have developer tooling that we talked about that. And so is it possible to use software engineers as a resource to get to that next level that we're looking for?
Yeah, that's really interesting. In Japan, upskilling, reskilling is a really big topic. But at the end of the day, because Japan has this declining population problem, they're looking overseas. A lot of companies, are looking overseas aggressively to find good software engineering talent. And I talked to a bunch of recruiters who are working for Japanese companies, looking at places like Thailand, and Malaysia, India, of course, to try to attract people to come and live here in Japan, to work. And, that's something that we haven't seen a lot of, but, just goes to show how, existential, of a problem this is for Japanese corporations as well. And, finally breaking down some of these immigration barriers. Any predictions on where we're going to be in a year or 3 years, 5 years, 10 years with all of this artificial intelligence stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a tough question to answer, just given what I said at the beginning in terms of how rapidly this is changing, right? I do think, I know we're theoretically in the early innings of adopting this technology, but on the flip side, we already see products being launched. Microsoft, for instance, said that they're going to do a full rollout, essentially, of their offering of Copilot on Microsoft 365, et cetera, really next year, right? And so a lot of these companies are making announcements, but it's going to be more wide scale rollout where you and I can start using it in our daily work, probably next year. And so I do think in the next year, you're going to see more mainstream users start testing out the technology. Now, do they fully integrate it into their daily workflows to get their jobs done? Still TBD. But I think people will start getting situated with it, understand how to use the technology really over this next year, which I think will be a very important phase, because you need to make sure that it's a seamless user experience and people don't necessarily get dissuaded by the technology that maybe it's too complicated or it doesn't work. And so it's very important for these companies that are launching these offerings to make sure that this next phase goes off without a glitch. Now, in 3 years, I actually do think that there's going to be mainstream adoption, and we're going to start going into maybe the late adopters of the Chasm, right? Where every company will say, hey, this can improve efficiency of my workforce, or, I can increase revenue generation by offering this new product. And so you're going to see more of those adopters come on board. And then in 5 years,
who knows, right?
Hard for me to say what that looks like.
Predicting the future is always a dangerous endeavor.
It'll be interesting to see how right or wrong I am with these predictions.
Just kind of as some closing comments, in Japan, we all as a company are focused on helping Japanese companies, form a bridge to Silicon Valley, help them to navigate these kind of difficult and, really compelling technical, issues and opportunities. And over the past 5 years, we've seen a lot of focus for Japanese companies on digital transformation. It's been one of the big kind of buzzwords every company is talking about. And we've seen a lot of investment go into digital transformation. But I kind of refer to it as defensive digital transformation. So a lot of it, and as we look across our portfolio, and a lot of them are operating here in Japan, we see that cybersecurity companies have done extremely well, as have companies involved in automation. And the first wave of that, of course, was UiPath, right, and RPA. And companies were adopting technologies in these two areas across the board. And any company in those two sectors did really, really well. Obviously kind of protecting their infrastructure, their people, their data, and also optimizing their existing businesses, right, through RPA and automation. So again, I kind of refer to that as defensive digital transformation. And the thing that I see now with artificial intelligence, is that companies here in Japan are finally starting to think more offensively. So, they have their security in, they have their automation. Japanese companies are doing phenomenally well, like economically. They're, generating incredible profits. And now it seems like, they really understand now, right? Wow, this artificial intelligence stuff is real. And so they're finally thinking more offensively, which means they're thinking about their data, and they're thinking about building digital products on top of that data, the machine learning, large language models, whatever it's going to be. And so it's really had a profound impact, I think, on Japan. And now they're grappling with issues around talent, right? Like who's going to build this stuff, who's going to manage it. Product manager is not a position that traditionally has existed within Japanese organizations. They have project managers, and they outsource a lot of their development, but they're trying to bring that development back in house. They're trying to hire talent to build out these products, to design them, et cetera, et cetera. And of course they're going to struggle there. There's no easy answers because there's just not the talent available. But strategically and directionally, it's really interesting to see Japanese organizations shift from this kind of defensive posture to really kind of thinking more aggressively and offensively, about their future and about their IT strategies. So in that sense, AI has had just a really profound impact on Japan.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think you said a lot of things in terms of them being proactive. And so there's definitely a few areas where, if I'm a company starting to think about how I build a product in the space, right, that I should be doing just in terms of setting the baseline. And so in terms of data, making sure you understand where your data sits, have a way to bring your data together, structure your data, clean your data, make sure you know what's in that data will be really important, right? But the other piece is once you have your data strategy, you have to think about security, right? And so there are certain guardrails that you might want to put in place. For instance, you might not want to have your data be used, like we mentioned, to train these open source or proprietary models. And so you're going to want to run the models in your own private cloud. And so think about, what you're comfortable with in terms of sharing that data. Secondly, in terms of guardrails, you also have to look at the data that you have. And so you might have contracts with your customers that actually restrict what you can do with that data. So can I actually use that to train my models? And so really understanding, what are the restrictions I have in place will be very important just in terms of thinking about your strategy in this space.
Just so much interest now in these areas. It's really interesting to see. I think we're going to be talking about this for a long time. I think artificial intelligence, in technology, there's always something new that comes along. It seems like artificial intelligence is going to be kind of a fundamental part of whatever the next wave of innovation and interest is. So, Divya, I really appreciate you coming on and, talking to us today. And hopefully we can have you on again, in 3 months, 6 months, a year. As things continue to kind of play out, it'll be, it's always interesting to get the perspective of someone who is in Silicon Valley and on a day-to-day basis, talking to startups, talking to other investors and other thought leaders in the Valley, to really give us the inside perspective here in Japan, because, we read what's in the news, but what's in the news doesn't always, cover some of the nuances that you shared with us today. So thank you so much once again for spending the time with us. And we hope to have you on again soon.
Awesome. It was my pleasure. Thank you, Marcus.
All right. Thanks, Divya. Take care. See you soon.